Hello everyone, welcome to the Knowmads Podcast. I'm your co-host Bhavay.
And I'm your co-host Prachi.
Long after abolishment of slavery in the US, in the late 1800s, the effects are still seen in different forms today. The unbalanced dynamics of power between prison authorities and prisoners illustrates hints of slavery even today and remains ignored. Our guest today is a historian from Rice University, and in her research, she particularly highlights the oppressive experiences of incarcerated black women in the late 20th century in jails in Texas. She talks about various forms of abuse that is witnessed even today in Texas jails. It's a very illuminating and thought-provoking podcast. I'm sure you'll like it.
Nevill, welcome to the Knowmads Podcast.
Thank you so much.
So let's start off with, how about you share with us how you became interested in delving into the experiences of incarcerated women in the late 20th century Texas for your PhD studies?
Sure. So I'm doing a PhD in African American history. So I started with African American history very broadly. Through undergrad, I actually did what's called oral history research, so conducting interviews with folks. And my advisor, it was part of his project. And so this was about the civil rights movement in San Antonio, Texas. And so I actually sort of fell in love with the methodology before I fell in love with the topic, I would say.
Wow.
So I started doing these interviews or, sort of shadowing him on interviews. And I found that the storytelling aspect of people actually explaining their experiences was so powerful. And so I knew that I wanted to incorporate that in what I did. And that's how I saw history rather than the sort of, we say like the great white men of history is more of just everyday people. So that's sort of how I started off. And then just sort of having more of an interest in the criminal legal system and the sort of legal aspect of history, how it's changed over time in the U.S. And so I was able to combine everything together a little bit, and that's how I arrived with doing more of this sort of carceral studies, but 20th century African American history, and then this sort of women and gender studies focus also. So it's like my three circles of the Venn diagram, I guess.
That's interesting.
Right.
That's interesting.
Do you enjoy, this anecdotal way of doing things?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I think that's one of the main things that draws me to what I do is this sort of anecdotes, hearing, we say like the qualitative approach of rather than the quant of knowing, we know the numbers now, but who are the actual people that the numbers consist of.
Right.
So.
Interesting. Okay, so you in your research you talk about Jennifer Toone, who was a prisoner in a Texas jail, and why don't you start off by telling us how did you find about her, and what is it like? Why are you interested in her experiences? What she experienced, and you can also illustrate all these experiences that she witnessed being in the prison.
So this person, Jennifer Toone, is not somebody that I've actually interviewed, but somebody's anecdote that I found through, I want to say an article online, not entirely sure, but she herself has written a few pieces for different online publications. And when I was writing this sort of proposal to do my research, it was a bit difficult to illustrate the importance of hearing people's firsthand accounts without having done the interviews to share firsthand accounts. And so I went down some rabbit hole, found her story, and thought it was a good example of the type of work that I could do. And so her experience having been incarcerated in Texas and what it looked like in terms of the different types of abuses of the system, more so in the sort of emotional, mental component. There's obviously the physical component, which I think most people sort of can recognize or they see first, when we think of systemic violence.
Right.
And so I thought her story just had very a very authentic way of pulling people into understanding that this is something we need to turn our attention to. So that's sort of why I touch on her approach, especially before I started doing my interviews, why I thought that her story was something that could help the faculty in my department and then in the school broadly who maybe didn't have as much familiarity with this stuff to really get them to understand why I want to do what I'm doing now.
So, I mean, could you illustrate some of her experiences that made you decide to sort of, bring about that story and let everyone know?
Sure, yeah. So one of the things that struck me in reading from her pieces, she's talking about how the sort of dynamic of control between officers or guards while incarcerated and the women who are incarcerated. And she provides an anecdote about how this power is held so tightly against these incarcerated women that, for example, even on a day where folks have visitations where they can have family, close family members and things like that come and visit them, how something as simple as a guard wanting to demonstrate that, once again, you are below me as an incarcerated woman and that I will always and still do have this power over you. And so she witnessed one of her close friends going through the process of just being so excited for weeks and weeks, probably more, that her child was going to come visit her. I think maybe for the first time, but I'm not sure. And just how the guards were able to hold that over her at any chance of being able to say, if you don't do what we say, good luck, you're never going to see your kid. We can write you a case for basically just about anything, and make it difficult for you, if not impossible for you, to see your child, and how they can wield that power. And then the exact anecdote that I use is how this woman, her friend, goes to see her child and is so excited, and the child, I think maybe a 5 or 6 year old, I can't remember, it's been a while since I've read it, but sort of jumps out of the chair to see her mom for the first time, regardless of all of the context of the situation, and how the child gets yelled at and reprimanded by this officer, which to a child is sort of a scary environment to begin with, and then have somebody in a uniform yelling at you to get your butt back in your chair, and it sort of traumatized the child. And in that moment, the mother realized, no matter what we do, there's always something that can be held over us. And so any tiny bit of resistance, or even just pursuing anything that holds that human dignity, or that requires that human dignity of a mother excited to see her child, can be wielded against you. And so she realized, okay, I have to do everything they say and everything by the book if I even want the chance to be treated like a person. And so after that, her child never visited her again, I believe. It was just not something that the child was willing to do, understandably so. And I think that it sort of broke Jennifer in a way to watch this happen to her friend for not doing anything wrong, right? This is something that there's no way that her child could have known that she wasn't supposed to do that. So that's just one of the anecdotes that I pull on, and the way that Jennifer writes about it as being an observer of this rather than being the actual person that this happened to, I think is interesting as well, because whether you're a parent or not, these type of things I think affect everybody who witnesses them. So.
Do you think it's unique to Texas jails, or is this also happening all around the world?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and something that I would love to expand to one day. Even though my project is Texas-centered, Texas-focused, it's certainly not an isolated thing. And so I think more broadly, carcerality, we can look at carcerality in the traditional sense of incarceration of prisons and jails. But we can also expand that, for example, even in Texas, but in the southern United States with immigration and the border, detainment, we can extend that overseas to, historically, if we look at camps, if we look at really anything that restricts mobility, we sort of have these black sites, we have these areas, for example, with Palestine, of limiting where people can go, those can all be seen as forms of carcerality. And so I think what I'll say is I think Texas is unique because of its historical context, going back to slavery, but it connects very deeply with the way that incarceration operates throughout the world.
Right.
So having interviewed some folks now who have been incarcerated in Texas and also in, for example, the eastern United States, they talk about how different those experiences are. So it isn't the same state by state, but that doesn't mean that it's not still happening everywhere else. We say like Texas has its own like unique flavor of punitive, of punishment and of violence that isn't maybe as common in other parts because of its historical context.
Right. And these guards are generally men?
So it depends. Again, it depends where, but they are often men and women. A mix, and it also depends, I think, on the level of security of the facility. So we think of something like a maximum security, that might be different, but I think for the most part it is a mix.
Right. So I mean, related to this question, when you were conducting this research, did you find I'm sure the answer is yes, but I'm still going to ask you the question. Did you find like a major statistical shift towards discrimination and injustice towards women, or what, did you hear other anecdotes as well?
Yeah, so I think there definitely has been a shift. We're incarcerating women now at an exponential rate, I believe, in comparison to men. I don't remember the statistic off the top of my head, but I want to say like in the past half a century it's increased, or even in the past few decades it's increased over 100, closer to like 400%, something like that for women.
Wow.
Okay.
And so it's certainly not that the numbers of women are more, but then like again looking at it in comparison, looking at it like within the context of the numbers, we've seen significantly more women being incarcerated in the last couple decades at least.
Right.
Right. So could you delve into some of the specific strategies of resistance that incarcerated women in the late 20th century used to foster human dignity and sense of self? Because like you mentioned that you were more interested in the methodology first, then you started being interested in this.
Yeah, I love that question because I can talk about, and my friends will attest, I can and will talk about this all day, every day until somebody tells me not to. So I'm happy to share about this. But basically, so there's a lot of different approaches to resistance, definitions of resistance. In my work specifically, I think of resistance kind of, as you mentioned in the question, as anything, or this everyday resistance is the term that I use, as anything that helps establish or reestablish human dignity and sense of self. And so that's a very broad definition, right? That could look like a million different things. Part of that definition is the fact that as someone who hasn't experienced this, I don't have the full picture yet. Right. So I go into this with the research I've done from other scholars who have done this type of work, with thinking of I ask questions about, for example, community, kinship networks, family, relationships of all natures, from people who are incarcerated together, but also with people who are from their lives who are outside. So friends and family, things like that, is what the power of community or these sort of relationships, what that power has in the ability to reconcile with that humanism, with that sense of self. Another example that comes up frequently in my interviews is religion or spirituality or faith as something that has helped quite a few folks, whether that's just their ability to like kind of keep their head down, read scriptures, those kind of things to try and make the time pass, quite frankly, just to get out as soon as they can without extending their sentence, without getting in quote unquote trouble. Other examples are pursuing different certificates or degrees. So there are often a variety of those kind of things you can do while incarcerated. Sometimes that's a GED, which is for like a high school, the equivalency of a high school degree, or a specific certificate. So sometimes that can be, I'm thinking of things like more technical skills, like, doing like air conditioning repair. Right. And then that kind of technical skill is something that can help people sort of reconnect with like, okay, I am a person, I am building a skill, I feel value in my own sense. And then also the transferability of that after, right? So these are all examples, I think, of, like I mentioned, community, religion or faith, education. In some instances, in some of the stuff that I've read, there's this aspect of like creativity or some sort of creative outlet. So sometimes that looks like reading groups or writing groups, poetry groups, art. That's not something I've had come up in the interviews so far. So perhaps that's maybe not as common or as allowed in incarceration in Texas. I can't make a definitive claim on that yet, but I'm very open to allowing the women I interview expand that definition or reduce it as needed. So those are some of the like immediate examples I can think of. And then of course we have, when we think of everyday resistance, just this sort of like refusal to do what is required of you. And that's like the more common one, as we think of like, if certain things are required of you to do your worst job at them or to do it to the bare minimum or something out of spite or anything that like pushes back to show that like I'm not cooperating in this environment where I have no semblance of control. Like this is the one bit of control I can take. And so if I'm, for example, woken up at 2 a.m. to sweep the floor, even though that's not something that needs to be done, but is an exercise of control, I'm going to do the worst job that I can just to show sort of like I'm not letting myself go to this system. I'm not adhering to it in the way that that they want. So
it's interesting because when we think about resistance, we don't usually think about things like, getting certificates, getting education. We always think about resisting in a more aggressive manner.
A rebellion of sorts.
Exactly. So this is extremely interesting because, I mean, a question arises that if men were in the same situation, would they also choose this form of everyday resistance, or would their resistance would be a more rebellion form?
Yeah, I mean, that's another great question, and that I think why I focused on women in the first place is when we look at, I sort of started with resistance to incarceration more broadly without a sort of gendered approach, and almost all of the sources I came across were about these sort of what I call conspicuous, like these grand gesture rebellions. We have quite a bit on these strikes, these protests, these different displays that are, really pushing back against the system and what it stands for. And time again, those are happening in men's facilities. And so historically, we understand resistance in this way that is very visible to the public, that is very we might use the word like aggressive or something like that when we think of it as sort of even violent, people associate that. And so I started to wonder, where are women in this picture? Are they just not doing this? Are they doing this in a different way? All these questions came up. And so as I did more work, I sort of realized that we don't have to see resistance as this one thing. I think it actually only hurts us to see it as this one thing. And by expanding, we can actually look back throughout the 20th century and back to slavery, actually. The way that women have resisted slavery and then incarceration throughout time can be very different, at least in the records that we have, where sometimes, again, this is just, not an all-telling statement, but men may have more resources or knowledge at their disposal to be able to have these sort of grand forms of resistance or rebellion, whereas women, just because the access to information and resources and things that they have in these oppressive situations, they may have they may have a different approach to resisting. And so I saw that over time, women will use these other kind of strategies to build capacity so that when they are out of this type of situation, they still have some semblance of self in the same way that men would. So I'm looking forward to making a claim or an argument that is this sort of gendered, like what's the gendered distinction? The other part of your question is I do think that men also use these everyday strategies. So I don't think it's like a binary in the way we would think like women only do this, men only do this. I think it's just that perhaps men do both. And of course there are instances of these strikes and uprisings and things in women's facilities. It just struck me as odd that we weren't seeing like a equal amount or we weren't seeing as much about it. And so that's what sort of brought me into these brought me to question these other forms of resistance.
And I'm sure the more you nitpick, there's further distinctions you can make. Women of color, and then,
Absolutely.
More identities, and then prisoners who think differently, have different personalities, and then the form of resistance can change, and the form of oppression also
Absolutely
is based on all of this.
I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, which is this sort of like we say, an intersectional approach to looking at, when I sit down to interview someone, not just seeing them as being formerly incarcerated or just as a woman or just really any one of these things. Again, I think it's more of a service to see the sort of all of their identities encompassed. So we think of things like race, ethnicity, sexuality, religion, location, like geographic location. We think of their sentence as well, and things like being incarcerated numerous times, for example, that may change their experience versus a first-time offender, as we would call it. So all of these factors really come together they come together in determining, really just shaping how someone may resist, and then also the approach of the sort of top-down of how the system sees these individuals, and then all the way from the system to the judge to if there's a jury to even down all the way to the guards who are overseeing. If they see, a lot of these guards will see the same women time and time again over the years, and the way that they treat someone who they may see again and again could change because they're like, oh, you're garbage, you're gonna be back, so we're not gonna treat you as anything above an animal because they see it, I'm doing air quotes, as like, these are your personal choices that you are making to land you here, so I'm not going to treat you the way I would someone who may have a different age, religion, race, gender, sexuality, etc. So they're all factors. It makes it more and more complicated the more and more we look at it.
That's right. So your research draws a lot from different disciplines, so sociology, history, Black feminist theory, and carceral studies. How do you think this interdisciplinary approach enrich our understanding of this historical context and the experiences of these incarcerated women?
I can't imagine doing this project without an interdisciplinary approach, so this is a good question for me to also think about. Although my project is a historical project and it's coming from an academic institution for an academic dissertation, I think it is equally rooted in the present in comparison to some of my colleagues' projects, for example, like we were talking about before. That might be more when we think of history, historical, further back in time. So with that being said, being rooted in this sort of present, we have all of these approaches available to us that are coming directly from the people who've experienced this. And so one of the things that I navigate in my own approach to this work is this sort of line between scholarship and activism. And so we have this whole other arena where people are saying, through my experience, this is what I suggest, or through my experience, this is what I recommend or advise against. And I think by taking an interdisciplinary approach, for example, by using Black feminist theory, by using sociology, things like that, oral history, the interviews that I'm doing now, although rooted in the historical tradition, also have a very community-focused, very storytelling-focused approach. And so I think it benefits the project to have all of these sort of, to borrow from the sort of interdisciplinarity, because we see it being so split between academic work and then academic work and activist work. And so I'm trying to do the Hannah Montana, take the best of both worlds approach, where it's, whether that's realistic or not, but I just see it as, I can't imagine really moving forward with this work without sort of borrowing from all of these other things. And I'm sure it's doable, but this is just, again, like my vision of how the project would look.
And the environment of research becomes much more collaborative. Then you have, there can be other opinions that can weigh in on the research. These other people from these other disciplines can contribute towards your project. I think that's also something that benefits if you're doing an interdisciplinary project.
Absolutely. I mean, even in designing this project, there was a period of time where I was drawing mostly from folks who are not in my field, who are not historians. I was drawing mostly from activists, sociologists, people in the legal world, people in all of these different spaces. And they really helped shape my work and shape this project. And so maybe that's why I can't see it moving forward without this sort of acknowledgement to that, because it's just something that's helped me in how I see this work and the way that I want to move forward with it. So.
And you were talking about oral history. So how about you talk a little bit about the oral history methodology that you used in your research, and how has prioritizing lived experiences through oral histories contributed to filling gaps in everyone's knowledge about women's incarceration experience?
Sure. So I guess to start at the beginning, oral history methodology being very storytelling focused, very interview focused. So what that looks like for me is sitting down with formerly incarcerated women to learn about their experiences, about the lived experiences directly themselves, rather than secondhand accounts from something like prison ledgers or other sort of documentary evidence, the sort of statistics, the numbers of people over time. So that's just sort of the gist. And I think one of the reasons that I approach this work the way I do is we sort of saw around the 2010s a rise in studies on mass incarceration. That was the term that kept coming up a lot. Oh. Mass incarceration sort of hit this boom in the academic interest as well as the public interest. There is this book, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, that came out that sort of grabbed the public, pretty firmly in shedding light on how much the United States incarcerates. This is, of course, not the first source or necessarily the best source to do this, but it was more of a moment that blurred that line between academics and the public interest as well. And so I argue that now we have a good understanding of what those numbers look like, how egregious it is, from a statistical point of view. But what I kept finding is that, okay, but who are these people that we have the numbers on? For example, the United States only has 5% of the global population, yet we incarcerate 25% of the world's incarcerated population, right? That is a huge number. That's something that shocks quite a few people. Yeah. But I haven't seen as much, at least in the historical field, about who they are, what their lives were like before, after, what is re-entry like. And of course, with mass incarceration being such a recent where we have people who are still alive who've experienced it, I thought, what a great way to combine my passion for the methodology for oral history with this sort of thing where I would hate to be, 50, 70, 100 years from now and to not have firsthand accounts of these experiences. So as much as it is for my own project and research, I do think there's merit to sort of building an archive as well for future use. And so I think in that way, having these, I don't know if this answers your question, so you can ask it again if you'd like, but having these firsthand accounts really helps us, like I said, understand who is being affected. And I mean, when it comes down to something like policy, for example, if a goal is to change the way we do things, which is certainly a goal of mine, then I think we know through studies that statistics isn't always the best way to change people's minds and hearts, or like it's not necessarily proven to do so. I think sitting down and hearing some of the stories that I've heard, really sort of heart-wrenching anecdotes of people's lived experiences, I think it does something different to a person. Right. Maybe not to everybody, right? I'm not out there to change everybody, let alone do I think I have that sort of influence or power or desire. But I in my experience, it's done a lot in my understanding of the African American community, one that I'm not a part of.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it can have that power or that influence for the broader public. And so that's just sort of one of the many answers to that.
I think that's very interesting because, I mean, it's more important, and I feel it feels more real when you see the person who's gone through all of this and hear it from their own mouths that, you know, these are the things that happened and these are the things that continue to happen. And I feel when we're trying to, like you said, to make a policy change altogether, it's important to see what actually happened through real experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, I mean, obviously it's better to have statistics play a role so that we know not just a lot of them, but even having the experience from one of them makes a huge difference. So yeah, I think I would agree with you on that.
And I think any sort of complex problem requires a complex solution,
Yes.
and that combining, I think having the statistics and then also having the anecdotes is important, like you said. And I mean, one thing that I think of, if I may, as sort of an anecdote, for example, we hear that the way that sort of the medical component of incarceration is really neglectful. For example, we hear that in terms of folks being taken care of their basic needs for things like medications or how they're treated when dealing with an injury or something like that. You know, we have statistics to show this abuse, but then hearing firsthand, for example, from someone who's telling you in detail through tears what it's like to deliver a child while chained up, while, you know,
God.
What that's like, or for a woman who I'm trying to interview a little later on, who, due to her medical neglect, had to have her leg amputated this summer, who otherwise wouldn't have, and then is shipped back in prison, who we know that this is not something that will be, in terms of the care that's required after a major surgery, that we just know is not going to happen. I mean, the number of people who die because of seizures or being put on the wrong medications. I mean,
Right.
I heard from one of the women I was speaking with, and I haven't actually double checked this to back this up, but the person that they had for one of the prisons that's not too far from here, one of the women's units, the person that they had in medical for years and years and years was actually a veterinarian, and didn't have any practice with humans. And so it just goes to show things like that, where, okay, we have the numbers that this is medical neglect, this is how many people die in prison, this is how many people require medications and things like that. But when you hear someone's experience in a very real way, I just think it has a different type of, at least for me, it like hits in a different kind of way. And when it comes down to like actually making a change, I think that these anecdotes can be really
Totally.
helpful.
I mean, because these are not just numbers; these are actual human lives. And to think about it, like you were describing in your story initially, how not only the mother who was in the prison got affected with all of this, but also the child who had nothing to do with it. So it's not just about the people in the prison, but also their families outside prison that get affected.
Absolutely. I mean, it's whole communities.
Yeah.
It's
A question about your about the way you conduct your research. For example, so I mean, it just came to my head that, for example, you have a person that you're interviewing, but then you also want to sort of, you know, get to the root of the problem. But you're doing oral history, so there has to be some time, you know, the knowledge is restricted to some time frame that the person has experienced. So how do you do that? Do you turn to texts, or do you find different subjects to further trace the problem back to its root, maybe?
So the short answer is yes. Use all sorts of different materials and texts, with the focus on like late 20th century and mass incarceration. I mean, like with any sort of methodology, oral history can only do so much, right? So especially in terms of a timeline, we can't ask people from the early 20th century about what it's like.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
to fill that in, there's a lot more work that is to be done in terms of, for example, I look at a lot of firsthand accounts of activists over time, because we have those in a way that's maybe published. Historians, well, academics in general may not see them as credible as like a ledger or something that we have in an archive. But I think combining all of those things, a little bit of all of those things, can help piece together. I have, data from something like different ledgers and records, for example, prisons in the U.S. South in the early 20th century that show the numbers of incarcerated women, and on this day they went on a sanitation strike to strike again. So these kind of accounts, combined with the work of other historians and other scholars who have done this work earlier in time, right? So we have historians who approached this type of work in the 70s and the 80s, earlier as well. So it's sort of combining, it's like piecing together, using everything sort of at my disposal. And I think that's just necessary to go back. For example, like I say, I'm focusing on this specific time period, but in order to sort of get to the root, it's equally important to trace it over time. And for me, I do trace it over time all the way back, because I think it has a different, it serves a different purpose to show not only violence over time, but then resistance over time as well.
Right.
That's
I think we focus on how these systems have been violent, and I think in general the public has some understanding of like this sort of racial injustice connected in a systemic way in the United States, but then to also show the resistance and the persistence of people over time, I think is really valuable in this specific moment, and hopefully will continue to be valuable.
Right. So one thing we noticed while reading your work was that you mentioned the importance of compensating participants and adhering to trauma-informed interview practices. So can you also explain how these considerations enhance the ethical and methodological aspects of your research?
Absolutely. This is another instance where I had sort of mentioned earlier that I can be a little hard-headed before we started recording. This is one of the things that I was not willing to budge on, and probably will not be willing to budge on unless my opinions change or are influenced over time. But having a trauma-informed approach for me looks like working together with folks rather than it sort of being this ivory tower, we're here to gain something from your experience, from your trauma, but how do we work together? What that looks like, saying theoretically it's collaborative, but then what that actually looks like for me is making it very clear that this is entirely voluntary. At any time we can stop altogether. If there's a question or a line of questions that you don't really want to talk about, it's entirely up to you. Compensation is a big part of that. I think we can, as academics, we get swept away a little bit in this like hero complex of like, oh, how much good we're doing for these discriminated against communities, and I think it's can be a load of BS sometimes, when in reality we know that like putting money in people's pockets has a lot more power than maybe representing people. Both are important, but as an outsider to this community, doing one without doing the other I just was not comfortable moving forward with my project. And so that's something I fought for, is to be able to compensate people, knowing that, okay, representing their stories in this narrative, which have been otherwise neglected to this point, is one piece of the puzzle, but also knowing that this group is a group of people who have been marginalized or discriminated or oppressed, or however you want to put it, being able to compensate is just baseline for the sort of ethics of it. And it's a little tricky, can get a little slippery in that I'm not compensating for, there's no way to compensate someone for re-experiencing any sort of traumas or for sharing these things. There's just no way to monetize or put a quantitative spin on that. What I do see it as, okay, you're taking 2 hours out of your day, maybe to catch a bus, to come to wherever we are doing the interview, to then catch a bus back. And I see it as like more compensating for time, and that this is a collaborative effort, and I recognize that your time is valuable just as, if not more, right, than mine. So that's part of the way that I see the future of this field hopefully going, and that we see it in this more collaborative sense. And I said I'm headstrong on this, but one of the ways that I would be happy to change is if this approach is not actually serving people, I'm very open to amending that, right? So like, again, based on the research I've done, this is one way to move forward with a project that people might be uncomfortable with me doing, for example. But if it no longer serves people to do things this way, I'm more than willing to say, okay, what does it look like? What does it take, you know? I think that's important in this kind of work, is like being open to that as well from the people who you're collaborating with, not necessarily from the bureaucrats at your institution top down who are saying, we don't know if we have the money, you know, BS. So it's yeah. So does that answer that?
Do you pay them out of your own pocket? So
no, I don't. I was very lucky to have the opportunity to apply for funding. Okay. I made a case through my department. My department has funding, you know, for full transparency at Rice University. The department has funding, and that's one of the things that they promote to potential grad students who are applying, is that they're relatively well funded. They want to see us succeed. And over time, seeing how my colleagues would make requests for funding for their research, so to travel to an archive, that's that's very common, domestically, internationally, whatever. And so they would be able to seek, you know, if making a compelling case to seek funding from the department, and the department would support them in that endeavor. And so I sort of made the argument that because I'm not, at least at this point, not going to any archives, but really don't have any international travel at all, like these people are, you could see it as like, this is the archive for me, and I'm building an archive with these experiences. And so comparatively also, I think what I was asking for was not, you know, nothing insane, but enough to make a difference. For example, again, just I think transparency in this type of work is really important. I asked for $50 Visa gift cards. The university was more hesitant to just give cash, which is very common. You know, that good luck with asking for that. Some places you can, but you know, the options then are, oh, you could save the university a little money for Amazon gift cards, for example, because they don't have that fee with each card. And I just thought, sure, but also perspective, how many of these folks I'm interviewing do you think have a smartphone or consistent access to a computer or an address that they can put down to have things sent to? A lot of these people are unhoused or moving home. So I was like, absolutely not. I will not be doing that. Like a Visa gift card is the difference of like putting money on your bus card or going to the DMV to get your license or groceries. I mean, it doesn't matter. And quite frankly, it's not my business or their business what's done with that. But that's been part of the process. So yes, I do compensate for this research. I'm very glad and very lucky that it's not coming out of my own stipend. That's and it's not something that was necessarily an easy process to go through. It wasn't, I won't pretend to be this whatever savior where it was this huge burden, of course. But it did require a little bit of work, and I'm lucky that I had support from different folks along the way in doing this. So.
Well, my next question is about what these obstacles were to get this done. So, you mentioned that one has to.
Like before you move forward, I just quickly have a question. So, are you afraid that people might not think this research as authentic because of this monetization involved?
Absolutely. I mean, well, let me take a step back. I'm not fearful of much, so maybe that's not the way. Maybe that's not the concern as much. But I've certainly had to question it, right? As people say, okay, so then you are paying for people to, you know, this is coercion. So that's part of a lot of the what we call the IRB process that I have to go through for this research to be approved in the first place. They want to make sure it's, I don't remember the term that they use, but it's like an amount that would not be coercion or would not be like underpaying people for their time. So it's sort of like this Goldilocks, what's right in the middle. And there's no standard, right? So despite my looking everywhere of how much, there's just suggestions of this scholar paid participants this much at this university and this one did this much. And I just came to my own conclusion based on that. But yes, there is that is a consideration that, okay, could this be seen as coercion? And, you know, I had to sit with that for a little while before moving forward with this. And I just thought, if someone is more concerned about this being coercive than like the potential benefit it can cause to one individual's life, then I think that we may be asking the wrong question or prioritizing the wrong thing. And to think of, even to think of, for example, my colleagues and friends who study slavery, and if their archive is, these documents of journals and things of enslavers about their, about their life, then what was the coercion that went into the creation of that archive and into those documents, and where they landed up, for example, in like a national, British National Archives versus those stories belonging to the people who have been, quite frankly, for all intents and purposes, erased historically, or tried to have been erased. And so I think I just put it back into the context of like, we see this as an issue because oral history is so different, but putting it into the context of other methodologies, I think it can be helpful in answering that question. Like, and some people may still think that, and I think that's okay. I've had people point blank say, most people actually I've interviewed is, I'm not doing this for the money. I really think it is a valuable project, and I'm so happy to have the space to share my story. That being said, I do not have 2 pennies to rub together right now. And so this $50 is the difference of me being able to feed my kids. So that's the sort of context where I think of it as like, okay, where are our priorities right now? Especially coming from an institution with an endowment in the billions, I also take I sort of like, we have to put this in context here, where especially with African American history, if we want to talk about like racial capitalism and those things, right? I'm like, how much harm are we doing by, so anyways, the short answer is yes, I've had to sort of grapple with that, but I don't think it has clouded the way that I move forward with this.
Nice.
Yeah, so you mentioned that, you're very strongly opinionated about this, and, you want to incorporate empathy into this, the way you conduct this research, that the person has to be trauma-informed, there has to be some compensations. I'm curious about what are the other opinions that sort of, that have tried to, sideline this opinion of yours, and what were the obstacles to when you asked for this?
That's a good question. I think one of the obstacles, at least the one that comes to mind right now, is sort of this moral and ethical debate with compensation. That is one obstacle that I faced personally, of like, well, what are you really compensating? Like, let's think through the ethics of a community-based or a collaborative project. If you are saying you value someone that you're talking to equally to you, and that you're going to do what you can do to acknowledge and reduce the power dynamic between someone interviewing somebody else, then what does it say to pay someone $50, for example? With a trauma-informed approach, knowing that this is not the lightest subject material, of course it has to be fully willing, enthusiastic consent to this project. But that still being said, what does that really mean? What does that look like? And so I had to grapple with this sort of like moral, ethical component of what is it that I'm compensating people for? And then what is left to be desired as well, on their end, on my end, whatever that looks like. And so that's just one of the aspects that was preventing me from being able to, I was not able to get approval to even apply to the IRB to have my project approved by the board. I needed the approval of a faculty member that I did not receive for months and months. And I think it was a valid question or a valid component to contemplate about my work. However, I felt like I did arrive at a conclusion, having done research, looked at other projects like this, looked at other academics, and then also people on the other side who've been part of these projects, looked at scholars, and activists alike, came to the conclusion that it's certainly not a perfect process, and in an ideal world there would be other, we could maybe move towards an even more justice-oriented approach to this.
Right.
But at this moment in time, this is what I can come up with the sort of asterisks that I'm happy to change it again.
Right.
It was sort of, I don't even want to say the best I could do, but it was what felt manageable to move forward with. Again, with the constraints of being a graduate student, not having my own,
Yes.
like there's also that dynamic of where I'm also I don't have full autonomy in some ways. And so that was one barrier to that, as just dealing with this sort of like moral or ethical aspect of the work that I'm doing. And then of course, questions from other people about how compensation can affect, or okay, if you're only recruiting, for example, through organizations that are like re-entry organizations, what kind of population are you getting? Is it really, representative of incarcerated women in Texas as a whole? All these questions that come along with, I think of sociology as the main field where we have to ask these questions in terms of, like how, I don't know what it says about the general, the general public. So all those kind of things to grapple with, but all in all, I would say I've received quite a bit of support as well as I've received, questions. So that's been really helpful too.
Right. So drawing parallels to the abolition of slavery, could you explain how the abolition of the carceral system similarly requires involvement from system-impacted individuals in political activism?
Absolutely. So that's one component of this work. I describe it to people who I sit down to interview with as there's sort of this past component where I'm trying to better understand resistance strategies over time and draw these connections to really show the evolution of the criminal legal system over time, or of this sort of, we'll leave it at that for now. And then the other component is very present and even future facing is my hope, and that is looking at what it means to reform or abolish this system. So to your question about the sort of parallels here between abolishing slavery and abolishing the carceral system, was there a specific that you had? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so basically I want to know that how important it is for people who've been impacted with this involve themselves in activism.
Yes, okay. Sorry, got like 2 brain cells on a Monday, but so I think that's something when we look back over time, one of the conversations I've had in a more casual way with colleagues, with faculty, friends, is we have some oral history interviews from slavery. It's a very infamous or notorious, these interviews have quite a few of their own problems, but we do have some of them of people who were enslaved as children, right towards the end of slavery in the United States. And then as they're adults, we have some interviews, and a lot of academics have used these sources in a critical way, or in a, over time it's changed. At first it was like in a, wow, look at what we can do with this information. And then it was, well, let's take a look back at like who were doing the interviews. What was the process like in terms of trauma informed, or the trust that has to be there. So that's something that I look at now when I think of the importance of, if we look back at something like slavery, and it's never helpful to play the what if game, right? We always say that with history. But in this instance, what would it have looked like if we had more sources from people themselves? And we do have some, let's not discount those either. We do have quite a few. It takes, it's going to take quite a bit more work to shed light on those and to give importance to those. But with mass incarceration and with incarceration, I just think that shows what we have the possibility to do moving forward with these approaches. So it's like, let's learn from the past, and that, I hear my friends say, I wish that this one enslaved woman who I'm reading about and learning about, I just wish I could pick her brain, like I wish that there, that there could be something more there. So that's how I see my work now, as like, not only for the archival sake of the future, of being able to have this like very important moment in history documented in a way that's not necessarily just top down, that is trying to include these sort of otherwise excluded folks from the narrative. But then in my work specifically, I can't imagine moving forward with reforms or abolition without including incarcerated women, without including incarcerated Black women, to be more specific and more clear. I think that reforms have been made over time, and I'm not confident to argue right now that one of the reasons they haven't been as successful is because the solution hasn't been all-inclusive or representative, but I have like the sort of sneaking suspicion, or like in a low-key way, I would want to say that, yeah, one of the reasons that we haven't been able to move forward maybe in the way that folks would want or would be most helpful is because we haven't asked everybody. We haven't considered, and we don't perhaps need to ask everybody, but when you exclude a whole population or a whole group, and historically the significance of the work of Black women in the United States, the activism of Black women has, I mean, gosh, I can't even, anything I say is going to feel like an understatement, but has made a huge sort of impact, I would argue. And so I just think moving forward, that's one of the ways to, at least to try to move forward in a way that's beneficial to as many folks as possible. At the least, I think, yeah, again, I can't imagine what a solution would look like without talking to women, and then specifically within the context of Texas, without talking to Black women, who are just differently marginalized, always have been, because of this sort of intersectionality thing that I mentioned earlier. So, yeah, right. I think it's fundamental, actually. I think the more that we try to move forward without this, we might continue to run into the same walls. There might be some, little reforms here and there, and that's a whole other argument. You have like reforms, and then you have non-reformist reforms, and then you have abolition as sort of the way that I think of it, at least. And so, progress is made little by little, but at the same time, I think it's more harmful to disclude a whole group of people than otherwise.
That's right. So having been a part of this research for a number of years now, what do you think are some of the practical steps that the modern abolitionist movement can take towards abolition of the carceral system, and how does your research contribute towards this?
Wow. Yeah, that's a loaded question. I think just in that, I wish I had the answer. And I tell that to my interviewees, like, I wish I just had this enumerated list of all the steps we can take towards, a less violent future. And anyways, in short, I don't have those answers, and I don't know if I ever will. It's perhaps not also my role or my positionality in this to make some sort of a broad claim. I always say that there's such a big difference between experience and knowledge. I can do what I have with what I have, but I'll never know what it's like in the same kind of way, right? But in terms of thinking of steps or sort of what I can provide from the work that I've done, I think, and maybe now this is more of like Nina as a human and less Nina as an academic or as a scholar, but in general, I think one of the things, which again, how do we do this? How attainable is it, is an entirely different question, but on sort of a broad level, I would say like the reallocation of resources is one of the main things, right? So we have this sort of move where a lot of the reforms suggested in the past to better the conditions for incarcerated folks require more resources to the carceral system, require more funds to be put towards, let's have more training for guards, let's have more, whatever it is. And actually I believe to some level, the more and more we put into the system, the more we build it up, the stronger it gets. And then also to the public, we can say, well, look, it's not that bad. We had sensitivity training. We're putting money towards that. Look, it's not that bad anymore. And the public kind of says, oh, okay, things are better. In reality, I don't believe that. And I think, sure, on a surface level or on like an individual to individual level, it's important to value the people who are currently there, who deserve better conditions and things, who deserve officers who may treat them with an ounce of human dignity and respect. But that said, in the longer scheme or in the grand scheme, I don't think it helps the abolitionist movement necessarily. So is there a way to have that increased sense of human dignity and respect without allocating more resources? That way, when it does come time to potentially reallocate resources around, there's not an even bigger chunk already in the system, and also not in a way that it then becomes very difficult for example, like we would say maybe liberals in the public to say, oh, well, things are getting better. It's like, once again, this is why I value oral history, is like, let's actually talk to people. Is it getting better, or is it just getting stronger? Is it just evolving? You know, at one time we had prison farms in Texas where it was agricultural labor. Okay, we still have agricultural labor. We still have women working on what they call hoe squad, which is, you know, working the earth for absolutely no pay for hours at end. That's still going on, but the system as a whole has evolved to this sort of like high-tech, technical surveillance state, militarized state, where we have all of this equipment and technology, and to say if it's better or not is not really helpful, because at the end of the day, it is violent. It is violence, whatever flavor you put on it. So anyways, that's just one sort of thing I can see. I always say, based on the work that I've done so far, I would say like reallocating resources. The three that I can think of, or the two main that I can think of, would be a reallocation of resources towards education and healthcare, as the main ones that can, if we look at the cycle of poverty, if we look at racism in the United States and how people end up being incarcerated in the first place, we look at the process of criminalization, for example, and the legal system. I think reallocating resources away from buffing up the prison system and toward things like healthcare and education is a really solid first step. Again, I really feel like a fraud saying this, because I don't feel like I have necessarily the authority. But that is, again, just from my research so far. And I'm excited to learn more of what the steps can be, again, from people who've experienced this themselves. Rather than just sort of these academics who we like to sit up and just hypothesize what it might be to move forward and what it might look like.
So in the criminal justice system, how often do these? I want to know about the current situation. How often do these policies actually come up? Are they talked about often, or they're largely ignored?
In terms of like reforms and things like that?
Yeah.
I would say largely ignored, right? So there's this term, respectable racism is how we think of it, as this sort of change from being outright racist to pretending to not be racist, and then, putting this sort of film over it, or, it could be anything with sexism or whatnot, is where we have these more modern solutions that actually just throw a blanket over the problem, then address them at their root or at their core. And so I think we, at some level, at like state levels, we have people who are fighting for reforms and things. Again, for the most part, like how far they actually go and whether they really reach the aspect of like awareness, implementing the change, and then enforcing the change, that's like a whole other process. Right. And so sometimes I think it's folks with the best intentions without knowing that realistically, how will this be implemented and followed up on? I mean, again, allocating resources, and then do we really know, is there any follow-up? Have these policies that are meant to help people actually been implemented? Are people trained on how to implement them? I think the broader answer is no, that it's pretty minuscule in terms of what would need to happen in order to actually help people. So that's a change that I'm looking forward to seeing, and I really wish I had the answer again of like how to make that happen, but who knows, maybe in the next 4 or 5 decades I'll be able to have a slightly more nuanced or clear idea of how to do that.
I'm sure the research will speak for itself, and these things will automatically start to happen.
So finally, for like last question, is we talked about how it personally affects you to hear stories firsthand. So maybe talk about how was your own mental and emotional journey throughout this research, and did you personally experience any turmoil or emotional impact while delving into these stories? and how did you navigate and take care of your mental state?
Yeah, I think that's also a great question, and something going into this that I sort of knew to be aware of. I struggled to talk about this a little bit just because I sort of feel caught in this place where I, on one hand, am realistic with myself, knowing that, okay, whether I want it to or not, this does have an effect on me. And so taking the precautions, for example, knowing what work-life balance means for me, knowing that I'm doing things with friends, I'm still going to my therapy sessions, I'm doing rock climbing, which I enjoy doing, or like doing something with my body. Maintaining those things are all really important. And on the other hand, I don't want to... So it would be a lie to say it doesn't affect me. It certainly does. And as like a very sensitive person also, it sits pretty heavy, and that has had an effect on my mental health, like point blank, period. On the other hand, I don't want to blow that out of proportion in comparison to the stories that I'm hearing and what the actual lived experience is. And so sometimes I feel like, okay, in order to do this work and to be sustainable in this work, I have to be honest with these things, and I have to make sure that I'm taking care of myself in the way I need to. That being said, I really have that I have sort of a response to like not wanting to come in with that like white savior complex kind of thing, despite not being necessarily a white person. But I don't want to come in as an outsider to this community and be like, look how hard it is for me to do this work, and so that's something that I don't have really an answer to yet, or I don't feel really settled with, because I think it's important to acknowledge without like overdoing, I guess. And so that's not something that I know how to do in a way other than just maybe not talking about it sometimes feels like more appropriate. Like if I know how to handle things on my own, then I'm taking care of it without centering that. Like I certainly don't ever want this to be the center of the narrative. That being said, I think it like moving forward, hopefully seeing more projects like this in the future, I'm a big believer in being able to sort of pass what you know on. And so perhaps not having it included in the narrative at all could also be a disservice. So in short, I don't know, but it's definitely there, and it's definitely something that I work through and I work with, and maybe over time, it'll get easier. I'm sure it will, but for the most part, yeah, it can be really, really, really harrowing. And sometimes that's just knowing, like, it's funny, I'll have friends or family members say, oh, I saw this on Netflix, this docu-series or something that has to do with what you do, and the content I consume is almost exclusively comedy, or like I read a lot that's like fiction, just like random, like whatever it is, but a lot of it actually isn't dealing with what I do, because when I'm trying to, find that balance, it often, so it's kind of funny. I'm like, oh, I appreciate that you thought of me. That means a lot, but I won't be watching that at this time. Like maybe when I'm taking a break, something like that. And so I recognize at this point, what I can say is like, I recognize that it's a privilege that I can step away from it. And a lot of people can't, because that is just their life every day. So that's like ending with a question mark, I guess, but that's never a bad thing.
Yeah, so. That's a great note to end on. Thank you, Nina, for doing this.
Thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time. I appreciate it. And I look forward to hearing what else this podcast has to put out too. So
thanks very much.
Thank you.